All righty. Tucker responds to Pentagon's criticism of his
Joe
show.
Biden was elected as a moderate who was going to stay the course, return this country to normalcy. It turns out Biden is changing the United States faster than any president ever has in American history. Our job on this show is to pay attention to exactly how Joe Biden is changing it. The New York Times isn't going to tell you. We think you have a right to know. Now, not every change that Joe Biden makes will matter over time. Despite all the huffing and puffing, a lot of things that presidents do are quickly forgotten. Some of the things Joe Biden promises won't happen. Others are just symbolic ring kissing designed to appease the interest groups that got him elected. But some of Biden's changes are very real, and they matter very much. Nothing matters more than what Joe Biden does to our U.S. military. Our military is the last functional institution of any size in this country. It's the last institution most people trust and
maybe because the only institution that Donald didn't try to destroy.
respect. It is by far the most important. A weak military means no country, period. So on Monday, when we saw Joe Biden pledge to bring a, quote, intense...
Yeah, weak military means no country, and that is precisely why I advocate for a complete abolition of the military, since I'm anti-country.
Intensity of purpose and mission to really change the culture and habits of the U.S. military, we paid attention to it. Here's what Biden said.
Some of it's relatively straightforward work, where we're making good progress designing body armor that fits women properly, tailoring combat uniforms for women, creating maternity flight suits, updating requirements for their hairstyles.
Yeah, for the hairstyle.
Creating maternity flight suits. Maybe those suits have been around for a while. We'd never heard of them. But here was the President of the United States promoting them at a...
Yeah, I gotta say, probably you shouldn't be like flying fighter jets if you're pregnant. Like your fetus is like pretty typically like sensitive to like your stress and stuff, and subjecting a fetus to high levels of like stress hormones is probably not a good idea. So
conference. And that phrase stuck out, not because we have some hateful bias against pregnant women flying military jets. We're pro-pregnancy, as we often say. We're also open-minded. Maybe pregnant women make the best pilots. The Department of Defense measures everything, so there's got to be extensive research on this question. If the Pentagon can show that pregnant pilots are the best, we will be the first to demand an entire Air Force of pregnant pilots. The problem is we're pretty confident that
don't do, like that would be the classic Nazi thing of sacrificing your people for the interests, geopolitical interests. So please don't do that, even if it turns out to be true.
Biden hasn't asked to see those numbers. We'd bet money that Joe Biden never even thought to ask. The rest of us depend on the U.S. military to protect our families and protect the country itself. But Joe Biden doesn't see it that
way. Yeah, kind of, but just because you've got this globally fucked up system of having all these different countries that are fighting against each other and that are threatening each other, and which is what causes war. Again, it's the whole global Nazi ideology, okay? And so the real threat is that. And so the real thing that would protect us, fundamentally, is to eliminate the global Nazi ideology and thereby eliminate countries, eliminate separate countries.
That way. Finding the most effective military pilots or infantry officers or SEAL teams is not his priority. It's not even close to his priority. Identity politics is Joe Biden's priority. It's all that matters. You see this attitude throughout the U.S. government as well as in the corporate world. Key positions filled on the basis of physical appearance without any reference to ability or experience.
But see, and this is another thing that, I mean, we gotta also criticize like these Democrat people who are basically saying, look how wonderfully inclusive we're being by like having equal proportions, like, you know, representative proportions of all sorts of you know, races and sexes and stuff in like the military, while at the same time not at all considering the problematic aspect of the military itself. So that is, again, see that like Democrats aren't even left wing, they aren't progressive, they don't actually care. They're not basically what the right claims them to be. Okay, they They aren't. They literally just keep on perpetuating the Nazi mindset.
Now, you can get by with that if you're Citibank, which now cares more about wokeness than about banking. They can explain the results to their shareholders 10 years from now. But it is not fine if your only job is to protect the United States from people who want to kill the rest of us.
And like same for the banks, like instead of criticizing the fact that like just rich people get richer, uh, they as long as there's an equal proportion of the black people and women at the top, then it's all fine.
The worst kind of dereliction of duty. Yet it's happening right now on an enormous scale. Just this week, the Biden administration announced that the Pentagon will pay for gender reassignment surgery for active duty personnel. How do sex changes in the military make this country safer?
What I'm thinking is funny is like Washington and like the buildings in Washington D.C. they're like built on a sort of Greek architectural models, right? And also the Pentagon is like it's definitely there's this thing of the triangle and the eye, and then now there's this Pentagon thing. Like literally, if the United States hadn't been built like that originally, and like if people suggested to introduce that now, the Republicans would go completely nuts saying it's like satanic symbolism and stuff, right? They would do that. But because it happens to have been sort of built with the foundation of the country, they're completely fine with it.
That's not a trick question. It's not another volley in the culture war. It's the only question that matters, literally the only question that matters. But no one bothered to ask it, probably because no one can remember why the U.S. military exists. Here's a reminder.
It exists because
the U.S.
people are
military
Nazis.
exists to fight and win wars.
Yeah,
that's its
exactly.
only purpose.
Exactly, which is why you got to get rid of the military.
The U.S. military
to avoid people getting killed by weapons and like just dying prematurely at the hand of other humans.
Not an NGO. It is not a vehicle for achieving equity. It's not a social experiment. It's definitely not an employment agency. Nobody has a God-given right to work in the military. No one does, and that includes all of us. If you ever hear this show whine that Delta Force is discriminating against paunchy 51-year-old cable news hosts, you'll know that we have lost the thread, because it's not about us. It's about the country. Making people feel valued and included is a good thing. It is not the point of the U.S. military. It cannot be the point of the U.S. military, or else we're done. Now, that used to be obvious. The military was the purest meritocracy that we had. If you get a minute, go back and listen to some of the speeches that Colin Powell used to give about his experience in the U.S. Army. The military was willing to judge Colin Powell purely on his talents, something that few would do at the time. Powell was smart and capable, and for that reason, in the end, he became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was justly proud of that, and so was the country he served. Would Colin Powell's story be possible today? No, it wouldn't. Joe Biden has put a man called Lloyd Austin in charge of the Pentagon. Biden plucked Austin from the cynical world of private equity, but you're not supposed to notice that. You're supposed to notice only that Lloyd Austin is black. The real headline, however, is that Lloyd Austin is the second defense secretary in a row to have been on the payroll of Raytheon, the massive defense contractor. If you saw something like that happen in a Central America...
Yeah, okay, but so the argument is that Democrats are just like Republicans, and they're just like basically colluding with the military-industrial complex, which is exactly what Republicans do. So, like, I would agree with your criticism. I would agree with it, except that you very much defend exactly the same kind of shit. So, like, it makes no sense. Like, you just call it's again a case of the pot calling the kettle grimy.
American country, you would call it corruption, and you would be right. For centuries, our military has been self-consciously nonpartisan. In a democracy, it has to be that way. The military has to be nonpartisan. No country can survive if its armed forces become a tool of a specific political party. We know that because it happens all the time, all over the world, and the consequences are always horrifying. It has never happened here. But Lloyd Austin is openly political. In his first days on the job, Austin made the entire armed services submit to a kind of political purity test. Anyone who had views that Lloyd Austin found, quote, extreme, had to leave. The rest of us watched as this happened. We saw it. Once again, no one said anything. The left approved. The right felt hamstrung because they support the troops. Of course, if you support the troops, you probably should.
Again, please stop calling the Democrats the left. If they actually were leftists, they would support abolishing the military, not just putting a black person at the head of the military.
Speak up when they're being abused, as they were. Then Lloyd Austin said about accelerating poisonous trends already in progress at the Pentagon. Worst of these is the use of irrelevant criteria in hiring and promotion. In order to meet the demands of various Democratic interest groups, the Pentagon has dramatically lowered standards in the services. Now, spokesmen officially deny this, but it is true. Ask anyone who works there. If you press the spokesman, they'll tell you that it's not really a big deal because traditional standards don't really measure anything. Well, then why have them in the first place? Why have standards at all? It doesn't make sense. They're lying. And they're lying because they have to lie. Politicians have demanded it. Now, if you dare to point any of this out, they become hysterical. And they become hysterical because they can't defend their own policies. When people can't defend what they've done, they yell. They can't even explain what those policies are, at least in public. So they attack. You hear politicians like Tammy Duckworth say that it's unpatriotic to question the Pentagon unless you have served in the military yourself. You haven't earned that right. Really? Can only cops talk about police brutality? If you haven't been elected to office, are you allowed to criticize Congress? They're not making a real argument. They're trying to silence dissent. Not playing along. Sorry. Every American citizen has a right, maybe an obligation, to know what the military they pay for is doing, because our lives may depend on it.
All right, let's stop it there.